Welcome to the first of the workshops for Jabblescram. Over the next several days until the end of the month, we're going to be creating games loosely based on Scrabble, possibly using the components, possibly using some of the rules, possibly throwing everything out and just starting with Scrabble as some sort of vague inspiration for our games. So what I wanted to do today, which is officially day 2 of the jam, B is for beginnings, is look at tile-based games. And I'm going to define that fairly loosely, as you'll see, and walk you through a series of mechanics, different ways that tile-based games have utilized tiles, and in some cases go a little bit into system design, in some cases just provide a higher level overview with sort of more ideas. At this point, I'm still not sure exactly what I want to do for this jam. I've got some ideas of possible directions I might go in. I did come up with a number of optional conditions you might like to impose on your games. Those are listed on the Paper Cut Arcade website for Scrabble Jam, or Jabblescram, I should say. Yeah, maybe those will serve as either mechanics constraints or thematic inspiration. Anyhow, so this is going to be a little bit history lesson, a little bit mechanics overview, a little bit, and then a wrap up with some food for thought about tile-based games. Feel free to jump into the discussion at any point. Either, you know, if I'm talking about something and you go, oh yeah, this game too, maybe just type in our chat if there's any, you know, games that you think, oh yeah, we should, you know, this reminds me of this game, or this reminds me of that game. If you want to actually, you know, make more of a commentary than that on something I'm discussing, feel free to interrupt and just do a voice chat if you wish. Yeah, so while I'm going to be disseminating a lot of information, this is also meant to be a workshop format where everybody's opinions and insights and comments are welcome at any time. Being a teacher, I'll likely go into a little bit of lecture mode, but there we go. Okay, so I wanted to start with Scrabble, the game that is the inspiration for this jam. And Scrabble goes back to 1931, and the inspirations were crossword puzzles, which should be obvious, you know, when you look at Scrabble. But also Alfred Mosher Butts, who came up with the game idea, was fascinated with code breaking and letter frequency. And I don't know if any of you ever did any code breaking. I used to love doing it as a kid. So early on, I learned about letter frequency and how to decode language or codes that were A, in English, because letter frequency will be different for every language, and B, that still displayed the words as words with spaces in between, or even if they didn't, right? So I used to love to create codes and crack codes, and so this is right up my alley. So in English, certain letters appear with much more frequency than others, E being the single most common letter, and if you're code breaking and you see a group of 3 letters together and that repeats many times in the message, you can be fairly certain that that word is the, T-H-E, and then you're off to the races and you can start cracking the rest of it. So when Scrabble was created, one of the design considerations was, how do we score once you've created a word, right? And so the scoring system is based on the frequency of letters and the ease with which you could create words using those letters, right? So Z, for example, is 10 points, and I think Q is also 10 points, and then it ranges down to a single point for E, because that's pretty straightforward. Interesting notes, Scrabble was at first self-published as Lexico. That was the original title of the game. And then as Crisscross Words. And originally you could pick this thing up for $2 a game. And then the inventor eventually wound up selling it in 1938 and or licensing it. Coleco actually bought it. There's a video game tie-in, ColecoVision, in 1986, and ultimately wound up with Hasbro. So another design consideration in terms of scoring, right, is the positioning of the bonus spaces on the board, right? So you'll notice that the biggest bonus spaces, the triple word scores, are at the edges or in the corners, which is really difficult to build out to because, of course, you're starting from this central space with the first word that goes down there. So I just broke it down in terms of how many of the different bonus, no, I don't want to do that. How many of the different bonus spaces there are, where they're located on the board. So we could, study that if you wish to. If you're thinking about rejigging the board, using the Scrabble board in some form in your games, that might be something you'd want to pay attention to. So I was curious about, being a real history buff, I wanted to go further back. And I was curious about crossword puzzles. And here's the very first crossword puzzle that came out way back in 1913 in the New York World. And crossword puzzles were originally called word cross puzzles. So here it is. Here's the very first one. Researching that, I found that crossword puzzles themselves trace their inspiration back to the palindrome. And here's one that goes all the way back to, this one was found in Pompeii. So it dates to at least 79 AD, which was when Pompeii was buried by the volcanic explosion. And basically, this one has 25 letters in this grid, 8 letters that repeat. And you can read it top to bottom, bottom to top, left to right, right to left. And you can rotate it and it can still be read all of those ways. And the thought is that this sator word is the origin of it, and from the Latin for to sow, to plant, to seed. And there's a variety of other theories as to some of the other words. So I tossed this in just because it gets really cool once the Christians grab it and start repositioning the letters to actually create the Greek cross with some remaining letters. And supposedly you could exorcise demons using this. So I just love that as kind of a, thematic inspiration for the letters that make up the palindrome, which were in turn the inspiration for crosswords. So by doing your daily crossword, possibly you're exorcising some demons. Who knows? That I thought was kind of fun. So where I wanted to go next was just start looking at some games and various games that use tiles, and what can we glean from these various games. So Scrabble has been turned into video games. One that I've played is Words with Friends, where you take turns. It's asynchronous play. You take turns adding a word and scoring. Another game which kind of sprang out of Scrabble is this one, Bananagrams. So rather than, this one dispenses with the board, and it's played out in real time with each player, if you're playing a 2 to 4 player game, drawing 21 tiles, and then basically creating your own crossword as best you can with the tiles. So you've got your tiles. The object is to use up all your letters. There's different variants of the game. In one variant of the game, you can, if you've got a tile you can't use, you can toss it back into the middle and draw 3, right, to replace it. And this one is, as I say, played out in real time. So everybody's racing to be as fast as they can to complete their words and use up their letters. So there, I'm going to come back to that a little bit. We'll see some games that are real time, some games that are turn-based, but right away we've seen, both versions of that: turn-based Scrabble and real-time Bananagrams. Okay, just a couple of mentions of well-known tile-based games. One, of course, is dominoes. And dominoes supposedly is from Latin dominus, for master of the house. This game was originally a card-based game that came out of China in the 1100s. It arrived in Europe by the 1700s and eventually got translated into tiles rather than cards. The takeaway from this is that it's based on dice. But in essence, you have a die that can roll 0 because there's blank spaces for 0 on the tiles. This kind of sets up something this configuration sets up something we'll see in some of the later games where each tile is 2 parts divided down the middle. So a rectangle divided in 2 to create 2 squares, each square of which has a different property. So this is one of the games where you draw a hand of tiles, so to speak, like Scrabble, where you draw a hand of letters. In this case, you draw a hand of dominoes, and then you're trying to connect your dominoes to ones that are already out there, matching at least one of the values, right? So I could play this 5 next to this 5. Or I could play this blank next to that blank. This obviously isn't how they'd go onto the board. This is just showing you some dominoes. So here's the range of pieces in a typical 28 domino set, right? You'll see that there are some doubles, 6, 6, 5, 5, 4, 4, 3, 3, 2, 2, etc. And the rule for those is you play them crosswise instead of lengthwise, so horizontally instead of vertically, and then you get a second turn. So in this game, you keep playing, passing if you cannot play, or drawing, and you're playing for the first person to 500 or 100 points. And basically the game stops when one player has placed all their pieces, and then you count up the number of dots on the pieces the opponent has, and that's your score, right? So you want to get rid of that. That obviously gets you into a strategy where you want to get rid of, pieces like this that are going to give your opponent a higher score early in the game. So that's a possibility. Matching in a certain way, where, creating a tile where you have to match the property on half of the tile, and then the tile itself being something that you score, right? In this case, what your opponent has left behind. And that whole idea of ending the game once you've gotten rid of all your tiles, right? Similar to what we saw in Bananagrams. Okay, Mahjong is another tile-based game that a lot of people will be familiar with. I have not played it. I don't know how to play it, so I'm not going to talk about the rules of the game. I didn't have time to learn them, but just a little bit of a historic tidbit. The game, in some form or another, might date back as far as 3,000 years, but the version that we play today evolved in Shanghai in the 1800s and was popularized in North America in the 1920s when it was brought over, translated into English, and sold by Parker Brothers, right? So just to look at some of the tiles, I find the tiles quite beautiful. I love the fact that they're ceramic tiles and they click together so nicely. What I can tell you about it is that the tiles break down into suits. So there's dots, sometimes called circles, bamboo, and characters. These, there are, let me see, so there's 3 suits, and there's, I believe, 4 copies of each suit. And then there's the honor tiles. And I love this thematically, that there's the 4 winds, north, south, east, west, and there's 3 different colors of dragons, and there's 4 different seasons, and there's 4 different flowers. And as I say, I have absolutely no idea how any of these tiles are used. I just think they're beautiful. And I think the division into different types or suits or, is something we could take inspiration from, because I love a system of tiles where the tiles are categorized in some way and have different properties according to that categorization. Does anybody know how to play Mahjong, and is anybody able to sum it up really quickly for us? What the heck we do with these beautiful tiles? Go for it.
I used to play with my mom. It's a betting game, and you're making like runs with the suits, but there's also these kind of side rules with the winds and the dragons. It's been a long time since I played, but there's a rule called Pong, or is it Bong? I can't remember. It probably varies by region. But yeah, it's very much like a what do you call it? Like a matching game where you're trying to make runs with the suits and try to kind of finish them and then not get stuck with leftover tiles.
Is it a partners game or an individual game?
That I can't remember. I think actually you can play it both ways.
Okay.
It's been a while. Maybe
because
somebody else has more experience than I do.
Sure, go for it if anybody else knows. No. Yeah, because I mean, when I've seen it in movies and stuff, it's typically 4 people around the table. So I was wondering if it was more like a bridge configuration where you're working together with somebody, or if it was every person for themselves. Okay. So what I've done next is broken down. I'm going to talk about games that I have played from this point on. And I'm going to break them down by mechanics and what the tiles are doing in the game. First up, we've got Carcassonne. And what I'm going to talk about is tiles used to create a map, right? And to create a map and tiles, the measure of success or the goal is territorial acquisition. So Carcassonne, probably a lot of you guys will know these games, but I'm going to just quickly sum up the rules of each one just to refresh memories. So in this game, you're drawing, each player takes a turn drawing a tile from a bag, and you have to place it onto the board. And this game makes use of one of the rules, the mechanics that you find a lot in tile-based games, where you have to connect your tiles according to the edges, right? So if I'm playing a road tile, it has to connect to another road tile. If I'm playing, if I want to play a tile here, it's got to have this greenery, this open field. If I'm playing a tile here, it's got to complete this structure, city or castle. I forget what it's meant to represent. And the way you score in this game is to put your pawns down and claim areas of the map. So you're sometimes wanting to grow areas of the map because you've got your pawn down on them. You're sometimes wanting to close off areas of the map and make them very small because your opponent is scoring based on the terrain type and then how many contiguous tiles there are of that terrain type. So in this case, we've got 5 different things, or 5 different terrain types in terms of the edges. Oh, excuse me, I'm jumping ahead. Correction, no. I don't know the number of terrain types. I didn't count them up for this game. Anyhow, and then this board is simply used for tracking your score, right? You could just as easily write it down. That's a fairly standard mechanic, right? Rather than a hand of tiles, you're getting one tile and needing to connect it in a way that aligns one of its edges properly with one or more of its edges properly with what else is there. King Domino is another game that does territorial acquisition a little bit differently. Sorry, so this is the one where there's 5 different colors of terrain. I jumped ahead a little bit in my notes by mistake. So you're building around a central tile that is on the board to start. And ultimately, you can build no larger than 5 by 5. Each of the tiles is 2 squares, so it's very much like a domino in that both of the segments of the tile might be the same type of terrain, or they might be 2 different types of terrain. And when you place it onto the board, you have to match up at least one of these types of terrain as you place the tile. So if I was placing a tile here, at least one, I would have to either match the brown or match the yellow. And then the way you score in this game is you'll notice there's some crowns on the tiles, and you multiply the total number of contiguous squares of that color by the number of crowns, right? So this blue right here would be worth 3. So 3 tiles times 1 crown. This would be worth 2. 2 squares, I should say, times 1 crown. This would be worth nothing because there's no crown in it. This yellow would be worth nothing, and so on. Each player is playing on their own, is building their own map rather than in Carcassonne, where you're all collectively building a map. So that's one consideration. Am I doing my own thing with the tiles, or am I contributing to a greater whole with the tiles? This game has this really cool mechanic where you're when you select a tile, you place down a pawn of your color, and this determines the order in which people get to select a tile next turn. So each turn you can select 1 tile. They would all be face up, and in this case, green would select first next turn, blue would select yellow, and pink, right? They would be face up, not face down, as shown here. These numbers determine which tile goes at the top and which tile goes at the bottom. As you're turning the tiles face up, you arrange them in order. Anyhow, so King Domino, super fun game, got a lot of cool mechanics, obviously drawing really heavily from dominoes in terms of its tiles. Okay, so other games that build a map, and in this case with, sorry, I'm just going to jump ahead because, oh, you know what? I think I lost a page somewhere along the line. Okay. Okay, we'll come back to it. Maybe I just misordered my slides somewhat. I wanted to mention the game Acquire, and I'll just pull up a, just 2 seconds here. I'm just going to stop screen sharing so we don't have a whole bunch of spoilers. I'm just going to see if okay. Yeah. Start screen sharing. And back to this. Okay, this is the one I meant to talk about next. I misordered my slides. So Acquire is an interesting game. This game goes back to the 1960s. It's a Sid Saxon game. It was basically a Euro game before there were Euro games in North America in terms of its design and complexity. In this game, it does something quite different with its tiles. It's like Scrabble. You get a hand of these tiles, and then you play them one by one onto the board when it's your turn. Unlike some of the games we've been looking at already, the tiles have to go on certain spots. So if I have the 5G tile and I want to play it, it has to go right there. So it's kind of inspired by bingo, really, right? You know, under the B1, that's where you put your tile. What this game is meant to represent thematically is hotel chains. And so as soon as any configuration of tiles has grown to 2 or more, horizontally or vertically, you put down one of these that turns it into that hotel. So this is the purple hotel, and all the tiles connected to it represent the purple hotel. This is the green hotel, the red hotel. The orange hotel would include kind of all of that, right? And there's a mechanic for when you join two hotels, the bigger hotel gobbles up the smaller hotel, right? So if anyone played something there on 9D, that would connect to orange, and so orange would gobble up purple. What you're doing in this game is buying shares in the different hotels, and kind of looking ahead to how much score you'll accumulate based on your shares. And you're always kind of looking at your tiles to see, oh, okay, can I grow my hotels at least the hotels I have shares in quicker than my opponents can grow the hotels that they've invested heavily in, and such that when one merges with the other, I'll be the one to profit. So the takeaway from this one is this kind of bingo-like arrangement of tiles that have to go down on certain spaces. They're all lettered and numbered. Okay, so jumping back. So that's territorial acquisition in a tile-based game that builds a map of some description, either a personal map or a shared map. Then we've got games that use tiles to build a map, but the map is simply a landscape on which we do something, right? So in this case, combat, right? So Betrayal at House on the Hill is one such example. The takeaway here is we've got a stack of tiles that we build onto either the main floor, the upper floor, or the basement. And each tile either says, main floor, upper floor, basement, or all three, or two of the three. And that's, you draw a tile on your turn. If you enter, for example, if I was moving my character and I moved here to this blank spot, something's there, right? Because I've moved through this door. So I draw a tile, the first main floor tile I come to, I flip it over, I align it, and I do whatever it says. Now the tiles also have the property in this game of having symbols on them that trigger different actions. So there's item cards, omen cards, event cards, and if I move into a room with that symbol on it, in this case an item card, I draw an item card and my turn ends and I get the item, or the event happens, or depending on the symbol. So that's kind of a takeaway from a lot of these that I'm going to show you, or at least the couple that I'm going to show you next, is that there are properties printed onto the cards themselves that trigger either a card draw, or that trigger items, or that trigger opponents to go down onto the map. So the next example is zombies, right? And in this game, you're starting from a town square. You're as you move your pawn into a blank area, you draw another tile, you lay it down, you grow the city. Towards the bottom of the deck will always be the helipad that you're trying to reach. This is a competitive game where first person to get out wins. And the takeaway from this one is that on these tiles are printed how many zombies you spawn, how many bullets are there for you to pick up, and how many health counters are there for you to pick up as well. This game, like Betrayal at House on the Hill, you have to match up doors. This game, you have to match up roadways, right? So that it can all join together nicely and form your city. Dragon Quest is another game that uses tiles to create a map. in those first two examples, the map was constrained only by the size of your table. In this game, the map is constrained by a grid, right? Pre-existing on the grid are these two central spaces that are printed right on the map, which is where the dragon resides. In this game, you start off in a corner. Each player starts off in a corner with their adventurer. You draw and place tiles that allow you to move through the dungeon. There's a track that records turns, and once you get towards the end of the track, there's a possibility of the dragon waking up. The dragon certainly wakes up on the last turn if it hasn't already. And when the dragon wakes up, anyone who's in the dungeon still loses, right? So it's, you know, I've won this game sometimes just by going in, only doing a few turns, and then going out and watching everybody else die. So this game also uses it uses a variety of configurations of tiles. There are corridor tiles and there are room tiles. Some of the rooms have doors, some don't. There's mechanics for getting through doors. And this game includes one really nasty tile that when you enter it, it rotates and it blocks off your escape. And then you got to hope like hell that you can get a tile that allows you to continue. I've played games where I can get, you know, where I've been trapped in a rotating room and died, right? Because I couldn't get out. So yeah, that's one of the takeaways from this one. Do your tiles rotate, right? Is there a mechanic in place that either requires them to rotate or allows you to rotate them? This is a super fun game. I love it. It produces a wildly different adventure each time around. Tons and tons of cards used in this game to determine, you know, everything from what item you find to what trap you spring to a host of other, what monsters you fight and so on. And then one more in the tiles as map category, Escape. This one is really unusual in that it's played in real time. A game takes 10 minutes exactly. They're showing a sand timer, but there's also an audio cassette that, you know, the goal is that it's a cooperative game and everyone has to get out. It's kind of like Indiana Jones running out of the temple. You all have to get out to win. And so similar to the zombies game, you have a central place where you start. You build the map outwards from there. You have an end tile that is shuffled into the bottom few tiles of the game. But as I say, this time, this game is all done in real time with dice. And so it's similar to Betrayal in that, oh yeah, that is a neat idea. It's similar to Betrayal in that you have to match doors to doors, but you cannot lay down another tile until you roll the right configuration of symbols to be able to do so. And then there's also this bit of business where you have to roll the right dice to lock down gems, and you have to lock down a certain number of gems to reduce the difficulty of the ultimate escape tile. This has a really sweet mechanic where if you roll a black mask face up, that die becomes locked until either you or someone in the room with you can roll a yellow mask face up, and then that unlocks those dice. So this is a crazy game. It's fast and furious. At about the halfway point in the game, a gong sounds on the audio track, and you all have to race back to the middle. And if you don't make it, you lose one of your 5 dice for the remaining period of the game. So this, you know, is real time with dice rolling to determine laying down your tiles. Okay, so then we're going to turn to path completion, using tiles to complete paths. So Metro is just what it sounds like. You're building subway, metros in the Paris Underground. And what you're trying to do is, in this game, you have a variety of start locations and a variety of end locations spread around the board. And you're trying to create a path as long as you can from each of your start locations to one of your end locations, right? And then you move your little car and you score based on how many tiles you pass over along the way as your route, right? Anybody can build into the middle here, and there's special rules for building into the middle. In this tile laying game, once again, we're constrained in terms of our size of board. And you'll notice these little arrows. Your tiles also have arrows on them, and you have to play them a certain way up, right? So you can't just rotate the tile any which way you please when you place it down. It has to face a certain direction. So that's kind of a consideration, right? You know, can your tiles be placed any which way, like in Carcassonne, or do they have to go a certain way up, right? Obviously, if you put them a certain way up, you can balance the game a little better in terms of, you know, the number of types of connections that you can create. Okay, this isn't, strictly speaking, it's cards, but I'm including it as a tile-based game, Waterworks. In this game, each player, in Metro, each player is creating several connections on a shared board. So you always want to make sure you're not completing someone else's tracks, right, when you're completing your own. It becomes increasingly difficult as the game goes along to not do that. In Waterworks, like in Bananagrams, you're working on your own thing, right? Technically, these are cards, but I'm calling them tiles for the benefit of, you know, for the purpose of this workshop. So you have to start at your tap, you have to end at your spout. Depending on the number of players, your pipeline has to be a certain number of cards long. Because these cards are rectangular, it limits the way in which they can be played. One of the mechanics is you can play a leaky pipe on top of an opponent's line of pipes, right? Unless it's a copper pipe. You can't play a leak on top of copper. You have to cap off any end points that are created by T-junctions that aren't part of your Waterworks. And so it's the first person to complete a line of X number of cards without them leaking, and then you play down your spout and you've won. In this game, we've got the possibility of messing up your opponent. Oh, no, this one goes way back. It's as far, I believe it predates him, actually. I think Waterworks goes back to the 70s. Oh, he could have, yeah. This is a mechanic we see a lot of, right? Complete the path. Actually, I didn't include it in this talk, but really you could actually include sliding block puzzles in a consideration of tile-based games, right? Where you're, which we see a lot of in video games, where you've got a grid with one hole in it, and you've got to slide the pieces around either to get your numbers in order or to complete a picture. So yeah, I could really expand this talk and say that, I'm just gonna make a note to self, that sliding block puzzles technically are tile-based games with the tiles locked into a grid. Okay, note to self. Okay. Yeah.
They're also in orientation.
Sorry, what do you mean?
The sliding tile games.
Oh yeah.
Move them, but you cannot rotate them.
Yeah, unless it's, yeah, even in I was going to say unless it's digital, then you could do anything with animations. But yeah, even in the digital versions that I'm thinking of, you typically rotating the tiles is not an option. There are interesting sliding block puzzles that are two-sided, right? So you have to keep flipping them over to see if you're completing the pattern on both sides of it. Okay, so then I wanted to oh, sorry, that got covered up. Hive, look at Hive. Which takes tiles and marries them up with something we find in chess, which is a capture the most valuable piece mechanic, right? Yeah, I love Hive. And in Hive, each player, there's the black and white tiles, each player is trying to protect their queen bee. And the way you win is by surrounding the queen bee on all 6 sides with your pieces. So here we've got hexagonal tiles, which is interesting. And no board. The hive can go in any direction you like. You each take turns moving a piece, and one of the core tenets is you can't break the hive. So if I was playing white and I wanted to move this beetle, I couldn't move it out of this position, because then temporarily at least the hive would be in two pieces, and you can never do that. So the way the game works is players take turns building it, one piece at a time. You have to put down your queen bee somewhere in the first 4 pieces, or 4 turns, I should say, of play. And each of the critters, this is really well done thematically, because each of the critters moves like the tile moves like the creature does. So the queen can only move 1 space at a time. The grasshopper can jump as far as it likes in a straight line, and it lands on the other side. The spider can scuttle around the outside edge 3 spaces at a time. The ant can go as far as it likes, right? As long as it sticks around the outside edge. And the beetle has a really interesting mechanic where it can crawl over other pieces 1 space at a time. This looks like it's got some expansion pieces in. I don't recognize them. I mean, that's a mosquito and that's a whatever the heck it is. I don't know how those pieces move. I don't know if any of you have played Hive and know what the expansion pieces do. Anybody know that? Yeah, we could look it up. But in any case, that's the game. And you can't, the hexagonal tiles present certain challenges, because aside from the grasshopper that can pick up and jump, and the beetle that can crawl over top, you can't, like, I couldn't take this ant and move it in here, right? Because it can't squeeze through that gap. So the rule is, if you can't physically push your piece, slide your piece through a gap, it can't go through the gap, right? Let's see, but the ant could, for example, tuck in there, right? Because that's nice and open and it can fit in there. So this is a game of capture, and very much like chess. Once you've got, once you've got the queen in check, so to speak, you've won the game. Okay. Now I'm going to cheat a little bit as well and include a card game. Let's wait for the comments to come in. Oh, yeah, no, ants are supposed to move all the way as far as they like. Yeah. You're thinking of the queen bee, maybe. Yeah, they just go around the outside edge. Okay. So this is actually a card game, but it uses a grid of cards, kind of in the same fashion that some of these other games have used a grid for tiles. So basically you get 2 decks of playing cards, and you're playing in teams, and what you're trying to do is play a card that matches one of the cards on the grid, and then you get to put one of your counters down. So kind of think of this like Connect 4, right? Except you're trying to get 5 in a row, either horizontally, vertically, or diagonally. And so I just put this one in here as food for thought in terms of, you know, you could have done this with tiles, right? You know, maybe laying tiles down on top of their corresponding spots on the board is kind of the takeaway for this one. Okay, so getting back to proper tile games, Azul is a tile game that is also about alignment as a goal. What you're ultimately trying to do is fill up this section of the board with your tiles. It's got a 2-step mechanic for doing that, though. So on your turn, you can grab all of the tiles. You must grab all the tiles from any one of the circles or from the center of the board. And then you have to put those tiles here in your staging area. So, and in your staging area, there's a space for 1 tile, for 2 tiles, for 3, for 4, and for 5 tiles. And if you once all these tiles are gone, once everybody has drawn a number of times and all these tiles are gone, then if we were at that state, then any staging area rows that you had completed, the tile moves over into a spot on the board. So actually, this is a really dumb move because yellow cannot move onto the yellow spot because it's already taken. So that would be wasted. But if we were doing this one of these red tiles moves over here and the other red tile goes back in the bag. And if we were doing this one of these yellow tiles, because this is a complete row of 5, moves here and the rest go back in the bag. Yeah, and then you're scoring based on how you place them down. So if I was moving this one red over here, I would just score 1. If, let's say I was, let's say I had filled up this row with black and I was moving a black here, I would then score both horizontally and vertically. So I'd score 1, 2, 3, 4 points, right? 1 point per each tile in a horizontal and or vertical row that I complete, right? Azul has that really interesting 2-step mechanic, right? I select tiles, I put them here, I stage them, and if I have staged them correctly, then I move them over here. And the game ends when any one player has filled up an entire horizontal row on this section of the board. And then you're keeping track of your score turn by turn. And then you get some bonus points for whether you've completed how many horizontal, how many rows you completed, how many columns you completed, and whether you've got all of a particular color filled up on this board. There's also penalties. If you can't put something in the staging area, you start putting it here and you start taking some negative penalties, which can move your score back. So Azul, the takeaway is you're picking up groups of tiles at a time. And so in this version of the game, there's more or fewer of these staging circles, depending on the number of players. But yeah, and it sort of becomes a game of, ooh, what do I want to pick up? What do I want to force my opponent to pick up? You're always paying attention to their staging areas, because I can't, once I put a single tile in the staging area, the rest of that row has to be that particular color. Okay, just to toss a video game into the mix, Bejeweled, right? So this is kind of similar to a sliding block puzzle, except that you exchange tiles. Oh, sorry. Testing 1, 2, 3. Can you hear me? Oh, good. Okay. Yeah, I don't know why that happened. So testing 1, 2, 3. Can you still hear me? Somebody give me a yes in chat. Good. Okay. Okay, thanks. So Bejeweled, similar to a sliding block puzzle, except you exchange tiles, right? So this might be a mechanic, right? Swapping the positions of 2 tiles to align tiles. The thing that we can't do easily in a tabletop format is the whole thing where things slide down into place, kind of Tetris style. Yeah, it gets a little fiddly. I suppose we could still slide things down. It's just mechanically a little awkward. So yeah, and trying to get as high a score as possible, trying to chain things such that, once I've swapped 2 tiles and formed a row or a column of 3 and those disappear and the rest drop down, that then more chains happen. That's kind of an interesting dynamic that comes out of Bejeweled and other matching tile games. Here's a fun one from my collection, Tetris the board game. This came out back in the 80s when there was this whole movement afoot to capitalize on the huge amount of money that was being pumped into video games. So you see a ton of video games being turned into board games. This game is actually kind of fun to play. It's played in real time. You have your Tetris shapes. Everybody has a board. That board has a blank grid onto which shapes go. And the goal is to get as many shapes as possible onto the board before the game ends. And the game ends as soon as any one player has built up to the top row. So if I took another L-shaped piece and stuck it here on top of this one, that would end the game. So the mechanic is there's a central box of tiles, and you're drawing them one at a time. You're putting them onto your board. You have to build from the bottom up. You can't just put one at the top and end the game. It can't be floating, untouching anything else. Unlike Tetris, the pieces don't have to drop into place. So imagine that this green square wasn't here right now, and I drew a square, I could pop it into that space. So I can fill in blanks, unlike with Tetris. The mess up your opponent mechanic from this game is that when I draw a tile, I can either put it onto my board, or I can put it at the top of an opponent's board, and they have to use that tile next, right? It's not that useful a mess up the opponent's strategy. It tends to delay them only for a second or two, and tends to be more often than not, something they can use anyways. And also I find myself just, focusing on the board when I play this rather than trying to look at what my opponents are doing. But it's a reasonable, fun, adaptation of Tetris in a tabletop format. So the takeaway here is differently shaped tiles, right? Oh yeah. Oh yeah, I hadn't considered the versus game for Tetris, the actual digital game. Yeah, it is deadly. The ending when something's complete and the ability to fill in blank spaces, right? Okay. And one last one that's about alignment, Blokus. I was surprised to see that Blokus actually has two different versions. This is the version I have with tiles that are made up of triangular pieces. There's also a version with tiles that are made up of square pieces. But in any case, here's the breakdown of pieces. Very much like Tetris in that you've got different shapes. You have to fit them onto the board. You're trying to get all of your color onto the board. The catch is here that unlike other tile games where you want to match the colors, you cannot place a tile of your color next to another tile of your color. It can touch at the corner, but it can't touch at the edges, right? Yeah. So a turn-based game with these oddly shaped tiles that are going down here. And again, we've got, tiles that form hexes, right? Which is kind of neat. Okay. So then I want to move along to the use of tiles to create structures that have some function in the game. And this first one is Galaxy Trucker. In this game, there's a phase of the game that takes place in real time where as quickly as possible, you're building your spaceship. The idea is that you've got a spaceship, you're going through the galaxy, and you're kind of the equivalent of a semi tractor trailer hauling cargo. That's how you score. But there's this frantic bit of real-time play. It's hard to see on this map. You can just see one blank space. This particular player has built their spaceship really thoroughly and only with one blank space. The mechanic is that you build in real time, and the first person to declare their spaceship complete, which you could do at any point. You could put two tiles down and say, yep, I'm complete. That would be a really stupid build, but in theory you could. The person who completes their spaceship first gets to go first in the game, which is a really big advantage. The person who completes last has all the time in the world. There's no timer. for building your ship. You just build it until it's done. And so the advantage of being the last person is that you, can take your time and really optimize your spaceship, right? So the tiles are all face down in the middle of the table when you begin. Everybody's in real time grabbing one tile at a time, turning it over, deciding whether to keep it and build with it or to put it back. If you put it back, you put it back face up. So the more you put back, the more your opponents can see and grab a tile that might be useful to them. In this game, the tiles have to connect a certain way. There's two types of connections. One is the thick pipe connection. One is the double thin pipe connection. And this tile can be connected to either. It's a universal connection, right? It's got the thick and both the thin, right? So it can connect to a thick or a thin. In addition to that, you have to pay attention to facing. You can turn the tiles any way you like, but except that thrusters have to face down. Shields and lasers have to face out, right? I couldn't put a laser here facing out behind another tile. It would blow up part of my own ship, right? So you build, and then at the end of it all, you look for incorrect placements. So this, for example, is incorrectly placed. The shield is pointing in the wrong direction. You would remove that tile, and because you remove that tile, this would disappear as well. This would stay in, or would it? No, all of this would disappear. Removing that tile would get rid of all of this because you foolishly only have that one connection and you've put it down wrong. So this is a really bad build, which is kind of nice to show you guys. So anyways, in this game, the tiles have different properties. The tiles have different connections. The tiles have different facings they have to do. You're also laying down cargo holds and batteries that power things and so on. Okay, and Settlers of Catan, we all know Settlers of Catan. So basically, in this example, tiles are being used to construct something that, in addition to being the map of the game, as in we saw in Betrayal at House on the Hill and so on, the tiles have properties, right? So the tiles represent different terrain types, and they're generating resources for the players. In this game, once again, the tiles only go down within a grid, so to speak. They have to form an island that's roughly circular. And tiles in this case are being used for randomization of the playing surface and randomization of which tiles kind of group together and provide more desirable building areas for harvesting resources. I'm assuming everyone's played Settlers. If you have not, I can go into more detail. Okay. So, we're getting close to the end, folks. For those who are hopefully you're not getting too weary. I should wrap it up by about 1:30, and we can just have a discussion. But I also want to explore games where the tiles move around. So we saw one example of that with Hive, but Labyrinth is a really fascinating game where you build the board, and then each turn there will be one piece that's not down on the board, and you this is showing you taking this piece and sliding it in, and then all the pieces move, and this piece comes popping off. And what you've done then, once these pieces all align again, is created a path. So the object of this game is to take your pawn, create a path that you can follow. Once these slide, it'll be joined, and follow that path around to collect the thing that you're trying to collect to complete your spell. So in this game, you're trying to collect 3 pieces or 3 spell crafting components, and this is how you do it. So this is a really cool game in terms of a constantly fluctuating game. Labyrinth, it's up at the top there. Labyrinth is the name of the game. The downside of this is it's really hard to plan your turn more than a turn or so ahead, or to plan your move, right? Because the board is constantly changing. So you can kind of think, oh, if I can slide this here, then I can get to this path. But in the meantime, especially in a 3 or 4 player game, 2 or 3 other people have taken a turn and the board's gotten all messed up, right? Oh, I see. Okay. Okay. And obviously, well, not obviously, but you see these little yellow triangles. Those are the rows and columns that can move. To keep things stable, there are certain tiles that are glued onto the board. When you buy the game, certain tiles are fixed and don't move, and that way it keeps your tiles from sliding all over the place. Yeah. And so included in that is the start positions for the players at the corners here. But really interesting, really dynamic game where you're constantly shifting this board. The board is never, is never stagnant. We've also got games where tiles scroll as the game goes along. And so this is a really clever game up the river where the goal is to get your sailboats into harbor. Okay, so up the river, you're rolling dice, you're moving your pieces up. There's one tile that slows you down. There's one tile that speeds you up. But the mechanic is, okay, yeah, I've seen this mechanic a couple of times, not super often, but at the end of your turn, or at the end of all the players taking a turn, what happens is the bottom tile comes off and goes at the top. The harbor never changes, it stays there. But this tile at the end of each round of play is constantly being moved up, right? And the mechanic is that if you have a sailboat sitting on that tile when it's time to move, it gets dumped and it's out of the game. So that's a really, can be a really deadly mechanic in terms of if you've now only got, if you've got fewer sailboats than everybody else, well, how could you possibly win? The other mechanic is that getting into harbor first isn't best. Because I don't know the exact values, I forget them, but let's say the first person in gets into the slot that scores 1 point. The next person to get a boat in, or the next boat to get in, goes into a slot that scores 2, and then 3, and then 4. As I say, I don't remember the exact values, but the idea being that you almost want to hold back and not enter harbor too soon so you can get a bigger score, particularly if you have fewer boats. But at the same time, you don't want to hold back too long, or your boats could wind up on that bottom tile and get dumped. There's also a mechanic where in certain circumstances, you can either move one of your boats up to your next boat on the river, or you can move an opponent's boat down to their next boat on the river. That can be really deadly if they've got something on the end tile. You can cause 2 of their boats to go out of the game. So yeah, so that's up the river. I saw this game used in, or this I should have put this one in here. I'll just show you it quickly. This is also, I think it's called Thunder Road, yeah. A game from the 80s, Thunder Road. This is a super fun game of car combat in a Mad Max kind of wilderness. It might be a little hard to see here, but basically the board consists of 2 tiles, right? With a road that you can drive on and wilderness terrain, and you're fighting each other, shooting each other's cars up. And the goal is to be the last one to survive. This is a continuously scrolling road. Same mechanic. If you pick up this back tile and have to move it up to the front, which is triggered when any one car drives off the top of the map, anything on it gets dumped. It's just left behind in the dust and is gone. So this is an example of a tile-based map that consists of 2 tiles that are constantly scrolling, which is super fun. Okay, So back to last but not least, and then I'll just sum up. So this might seem like a weird one to include in tile-based games, but Jenga. I mean, technically, we could think of these as three-dimensional tiles, right? And of course, we all know Jenga. You take turns pulling a tile out, putting it on top, stacking them up, and if the thing collapses, then you've lost the game. So the game, the goal in this one is just outlast your opponent, right? Yeah. So what I want to do was just wrap up by just kind of summarizing some of the points I brought up. So one is, do we have a board or we don't have a board, right, in a tile-based game? If we have a board, are the tiles, like, where the tiles go, are those already printed on the board, like in sequence, or can each tile only go on one spot on the board, like in Acquire? Or is the board blank? It simply serves to constrain how far the tiles can build outwards, but the tiles have to orient a certain way, like in Metro. Or is the board blank and the tiles can go down any which way, right? Is the board that consists of tiles constantly moving? Are the tiles themselves moving around, like in Labyrinth? Does each player have their own separate board that they're building on, like in Azul? And then over and above that, does the entire board have to get filled, or can spots be left blank, right? And if we're having no board, if we're just playing tiles onto a table, is that a single, like, do all the tiles have to group together, like in Carcassonne, or is each player building their own board, so to speak, or their own grouping of tiles? I'll just wait till, I think Jesse might be typing. Okay, maybe I'll slide along. Oh, is that going to... I don't see anything appearing. Okay, I'm going to move along. Got a couple more points to consider. Okay, and then when it comes to placing tiles, right? Do we have to match the edges, like in Carcassonne? So a river has to join a river, a road has to join a road, but can the tile be rotated before being placed, so it can go any way up, right? Or can the tile be rotated, but do certain tiles have to go on the outside edge, like in Galaxy Trucker, and point in a certain direction? Or do we have sort of a domino style double tile, and only half of the tile has to match, like in King Domino, whatever we're placing it adjacent to? Or do we have tiles that cannot join certain other tiles, like in Blokus, right? We can't put two colors next to each other, or the same color next to each other, I should say. I didn't put this down, but how many tiles can we put down? Can we put down, are we just putting one tile down on our turn, or are we putting as many as we like down on our turn from a hand, right? And, but the tiles that we put down have to form a certain configuration, like in Scrabble, they have to spell a word, right? Or or are we moving tiles around and we're trying to match colors, right? Are we putting tiles down to complete a path, right? So the edges have to align properly. Are there tiles that can rotate once they're in play, or that must rotate once they're in play, like Dungeon Quest, excuse me? Are tiles constantly being replaced, like in Labyrinth? I suppose you could do Labyrinth just by laying tiles on top of other tiles, really, although the sliding mechanic is much more elegant. Are we removing tiles one by one, right? Like in Jenga? Or are we slamming tiles down in real time, like in Galaxy Trucker and Escape? Okay, just a couple more points for you. How do we get tiles, right? Do we draw one at a time and then we have to place it, like in Carcassonne? Do we have a hand of tiles, some of which might be placed, like in Scrabble? Are the tiles always on the board, right? And all we're doing is moving them, like in Hive? Are the tiles in some sort of grab pile, like in Galaxy Trucker, and we can grab one and then choose to keep it or not keep it, right? Or are we selecting tiles from groups that are laid out on the table, like in Azul? And do I have another slide? Yeah. How do we organize the tiles? Are they in groups, right? Are there wild tiles, right? Like in Scrabble, there's a blank tile that can be any letter, but that has 0 score associated with it. Or are tiles divided into, the tile itself divided into sections, like in King Domino, 2 different sections with 2 different properties. And then finally, scoring, right? Do our tiles have different values, like in Scrabble? Do some tiles have multipliers, like in King Domino with its crowns? You know, a tile might convey 1 crown or 2 crowns or 3 crowns worth of value, which is a multiplier. Are we scoring when we place a tile both horizontally and vertically at the same time, like in Azul? Are we joining tiles together to form larger and larger areas of the map, like in Carcassonne? Do tiles have different properties? Like in Galaxy Trucker, the tiles do different things. This tile is a laser beam, this tile or laser gun, this tile is a shield, this tile is a storage unit. Or is there a destination tile that we're trying to reach, like in Up the River, right? And that's how we score. So yeah, thank you for listening. That was a